Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this hearing of the Budget and Finance Committee for Monday, January 29th, 2018. I'm Paul Krikorian, joined by my colleagues, Mr. Blumenfield and Mr. Englander, and we're ready to begin. Members, I would have proposed the following items for consent approval, but for cards, which we'll be taking in a moment. So I would have recommended item 4, 6, 9, 10, well, 4, 6, 9, and 12 for approval, and items 10 and 11 for noting and filing, unless you have questions or concerns, but you might just make note of that because we will take cards on them. We have 3 closed session items, which I'll take after the multiple item cards, and then we'll proceed to our regular agenda. So let's go ahead and begin with our multiple item speakers. Mr. Previn for 2 minutes, followed by Mr. Spindler for 2 minutes. Mr. Previn, welcome. I'm going to do general public comment following closed session.
For disclosing that.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. Mr. Spindler's continuing to make animal sounds, disrupting the meeting, and
so
wanted you to
this
be
will
aware
be
of
the
that.
one and only warning. If anything distracting happens from Mr. Spindler or anyone else during Mr. Previn's comments or the action of this committee, they will promptly be removed from the meeting.
Great. And just before you start my time, same goes for Mr. Englander pestering the speaker, because he does that when you're not here.
That's not your business. Just go ahead and start his
We'll do my
time.
best, but it has to be fair.
Speak to the items. No, there's
Thank you,
no.
sir. It's Eric Previn.
I run the meeting, Mr. Previn.
That's right.
Go ahead and speak.
Paul Krikorian running the meeting. It's Eric Previn, member of the public, speaking at the meeting briefly. I would just like to say thank you for putting on the agenda the CEQA panel of attorneys, which is put together by the city attorney group of firms that will help when communities frustrated by what's happening try to sue developers and the city. Like in my neighborhood, they sued Sportsman's Landing, Sportsman's Lodge, and the city. And Burke William Sorensen was brought in, an outstanding firm. Richard Weintraub, the owner of the development project, paid that bill.
You're not speaking to any item on the agenda.
Well, this is a CEQA panel, sir. This is exactly how it works. Burke William Sorensen was one of those. So Nikki Miner and the folks up in Bel Air are against this as well. Anybody who knows how it works is against it because it's completely an unlevel playing field, and it's designed to crush community groups while having the developers underwrite it. And so there's no disincentive for the city because the city attorney doesn't pay the bill. So it's a real problem. Also, and this is for Mr. Blumenfield, who's done a great job up on the out front thing, which I know people are working on, but the refund for NBC Universal for $341,000 under the banner of E-Entertainment at item number 12. Here's the thing. When we ask, well, what is the nature of that detail? Why the refund of so much money to a treasured partner? And the response is, you can't look. And then we ask our council folk, well, what's it about? And they say, we don't deal with that. A big red flag is raised up into, because we need to know why Outfront Media got almost $900,000, why Universal's getting $350,000, why Jeco Residential, which is one of the Jameson Group, some of the most well-heeled developers in our possibly the nation, are getting giant refunds, and yet we can't figure it out. So we turn to our council, and certainly, Mr. Krikorian, you could figure it out and report back why they are getting all these duplicative payments. It seems unsavory. Judgment obligation bonds will be pushed back once again. But we just confirmed them until November 2017. So they start losing eligibility for reimbursement by April 2018. So whereas I wish we could say we were done with it, we're not.
Okay.
So let's keep tracking it closely.
Mr.
Thank
Spindler.
you.
Thank you. 2 minutes. Stick to the agenda. General public comment will be later.
So we get to number 7, debt financing, judgment obligation bonds. See, the problem is that these assholes up here, they get sued so goddamn much that what happens, the city gets it, we lost quorum, everybody. We only have 2 members now. The meeting is adjourned. Okay, so now we get back to this fucking debt finance. You borrow from the Jewish bankers in New York, such as Mellon and Chase and Wells Fargo, to finance settlements because these fucking idiots up here are too stupid to settle and have a financial settlement panel of outside attorneys. They get emotional. See, they base everything on emotions. They get upset. angry. And as a result, they don't settle for the best interests of the city. So they have to borrow and borrow and borrow and pay and pay and pay. And that's good because many of the closed session items today, including e-entertainment, is bankrupting the city. Yay! And that's exactly what we want to see. That way, once the city's bankrupt, these pricks up here get fired, and then we put in a set of licensed, bonded, and insured corporate trustees, because the city will be put in involuntary Chapter 9. That will come later. Yes, but you see the sneakiness. Nobody here noted that one of the three members got up and left. So under the Brown Act, 54-950, Bob Blumenfield just broke the quorum, and this meeting is hereby illegally being held. And all the votes today are void ab initio. Yes, they're void ab initio. Finally, fuck you.
All right, we will now, let's go ahead and do our consent items, members. If there's no objection to approval of items 4, 6, 9, and 12, and then of noting and filing items 10 and 11. If there's no objection to acting as follows, that will be the action of the committee as to each of those items. All right, that brings us now into closed session. So we'll begin our closed session with item number 1 and proceed in order. All right, we are back in open session, and we're ready to take up item number 5.
Item number 5 is the City Attorney Report and Ordinance adding Chapter 172 to Division 5 of the Los Angeles Administrative Code, LAAC, to create the Economic Development Trust Fund for the receipt and disbursement of 50% of all monies for economic development projects or programs that are received by the city from the sale or lease of city-owned property, and amending LAAC Section 5.500 to authorize the use of real property trust funds for economic development. The Economic Development, Information Technology, and General Services Committees have approved this matter.
Miguel Dagger, Deputy City Attorney, and I don't think I could have said it better. It was kind of all-inclusive as to what this ordinance does. I'm not sure what else to present. I mean, we're adding a admin code section to establish a new trust fund, and the purpose is that any property that's designated as economic development, half of the sale proceeds are supposed to be deposited into that fund for economic development purposes. And it's also amending the real property council district trust funds to give them more flexibility in expending money for economic development within their not project areas, within their council districts.
Okay, so why don't we hear from EWDD and hear if there's concerns by the CAO and CLA.
I'm sorry, what the question? This is Daisy Hernandez with Economic and Workforce Development.
Did you want to present on this item?
On this item, sure. So this ordinance is in response to actions stipulated in the report from the Ad Hoc Committee on Jobs, which was approved by Council in April 2016. The guidelines for the trust fund were presented under Council File number 12-1549-S3, approved in November 2016. And we just want to, emphasize that based on the guidelines that have been approved, the projects would be identified for economic development purposes are the ones that would be subject, of course, to the Economic Development Trust Fund. So we would definitely be working with council closely to identify the proposed economic development projects. And these projects would go through the asset management evaluation framework, which it would be designated under 4D, under this management evaluation framework. Do you have any questions that we may answer for you?
I have a number, but I just want to make sure that everyone here has exhausted what they want to say first. So any because I had understood that there were some concerns that the CAO and CLA had expressed, but I can, it's kind of technical things, but it looks like the language of the ordinance as it's drafted in subsection B references the sale and lease of city-owned property or any other monies which are otherwise appropriated to the fund. There doesn't appear to be a limitation on which property, the sale of which city-owned properties. So it was our intention that where there were city-owned properties that were to be used for economic development purposes and were disposed of for that purpose, that half of the proceeds would be going into the Economic Development Trust Fund. And
Right.
from my, quick reading, I said, this seems to have a broader application than that.
Right. Well, again, this is specifically for properties or projects that have been designated under 4D in the asset management evaluation framework. So the report, I know the ordinance is not reflecting that, and I believe CAO is making the recommendation to amend the language. So.
Okay.
So Jackie Wagner with the CAO's office. The asset management evaluation framework that Daisy referenced before was approved by council in May of 2016. That asset evaluation framework provided a guideline and a framework for which the city could go about reviewing and disposing of its real estate assets. There are approximately 7 types of properties, including those that are designated for municipal use, nonprofit, economic development for joint use, and then under 4D, it's for economic development purposes. There would only be a subset of these projects and only to the extent that the council office works very directly and closely with EWDD to identify those projects. There are not that many projects. For example, the one that I think is in question right now is Marlton Square. In the past, we did the Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf. So there are very few projects or properties, rather, that fall under that particular category. The other types of projects that also fall under the framework are those that are identified for housing and for homeless navigation sites and storage. So it's actually a very limited subsection of properties that are designated for economic development that would fall under their purview.
As you said, the ordinance is intentionally written a little bit broader than
Yeah.
that. You could designate other monies if you so wished, and I think that was done that way intentionally for economic development. The council doesn't have to, but it's something. This is like creating a bank account, and they didn't want to limit what could be deposited into that bank account.
Yes and no. I mean, you could take that position to have a flexible policy, but I think part of the objective here is to ensure that among the many different policies that we might be serving with city property, where one of these economic development transactions is made, that the proceeds of that be preserved in a trust fund that's to be spent on economic development activities. And if that's sort of left discretionary on a project-by-project basis, I'm concerned that the fund would not be adequately funded. And further challenge.
Opposite of what I was thinking you were concerned with. Yeah, I think it was intended that whenever a property came into council, they say, we're going to designate this as an economic development property. And at that time, council would make the decision, yeah, we're going to, unless the CEO sees this differently, that yes, this money, half of this money is going to go into this fund. And council would retain some discretion to say, no, we're not going to designate this as economic development, but we're going to use it for this project anyway. And half the money wouldn't get deposited to that fund.
Yeah.
Am I correct? I'm not always sure about following the money.
You're basically correct, and I understand your concern that the fund may not be adequately funded. I'm not sure how to address that piece.
It's also something, I mean, I appreciate your explanation about the subcategories of property and what it says in paragraph 4D. But defining where economic development stops and, say, affordable housing begins on a particular project is not necessarily an easy, there isn't necessarily an objective test that says this one is a housing project, this one is an economic development project, because a lot of times they're blended together. And so that's what I'm trying to navigate my way through a little.
And we have seen where a project may have been designated for economic development, but down the line the purpose of it was changed, maybe because there were not enough responses, or maybe the responses to an RFP or a solicitation document called for a different type of project, like, for example, a housing project, and then that became a housing venture. So it's pretty fluid, and I think that was the flexibility that we were looking for, so that to the extent that a council office, encountered a unique project or had, project had unique circumstances, that would be flexible enough to determine what the highest and best use is, and be flexible with it.
Yeah, well, and just to be clear, members, half of the proceeds go into the property trust fund for the district
Either way,
anyway. So what we're talking about is the 50% that would otherwise be general fund, and whether that goes to the general fund, whether it goes to an affordable housing trust fund, whether it goes to an economic development trust fund or some other function, it makes no difference to the developer whatsoever, because it doesn't change the price. It's merely where we're putting the proceeds. So why don't we do this? Because I'm hearing you now that the intention was to try to create greater flexibility for us, and that may make sense, but that's not the direction that I was thinking in when we initiated this. So I'd like to rethink it a little bit. But if any of you have any comments now, I'd like to hold it a week, and then let's have a further discussion about it in light of that.
To add to the discussion a little bit, if we want to lock in how the money is going to be used, it really wouldn't be in the trust fund, I guess. There's an ordinance 7.2, which authorizes the sale for economic development, and I think there's a similar one for affordable housing sites. And I guess that's where the amendment would need to go if we were going to say any property sold under this thing, that money has to go here.
That might be an
that's
approach.
What's desired.
Yeah, that might be the better approach than trying to define it in this, and then you just cross-reference it, maybe. Let me
And if
process it a little bit more, and I think members want to,
May I
Yeah,
add
go ahead.
something? Janelle
Then Mr.
Parra.
Kretz.
Janelle Parra from Economic and Workforce Development Department. I just wanted to emphasize the importance of having an economic development trust fund as far as our department is concerned. As the people in the table know, some of these economic development projects does not happen just in one fiscal year. Most of the time, from the inception until the close, there's a few fiscal years that happen. And I wanted to say that on most of these projects, when we enter into an the exclusive negotiating agreement with the developer, it would require some type of deposit that now resides in our general fund, and at the end of the fiscal year, it would revert back to the general fund pool. With this fund, we would be able to track down, retain some of those monies from a third party and use it for whatever purpose it's set aside for per contract, for better, for better keeping also of accounting-wise.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's why, we wanted to push for this through the Jobs Creation Committee to get this established, just, how we define which projects this applies to, and then even what the expenditures from the fund should be. I think a subject, I need to think about it a little bit more. Let me go to Mr. Kretz and Mr. Blumenfield.
I don't know if it misses what you're getting at with this, but I wonder if the 50% that was going to the general fund could just go to economic development.
Well, that's the objective.
Without having to worry too much about judging the project and how much of it's economic development focused, or it having to fit under certain categories. Just any piece of property that we sell as surplus, have that 50% go to economic development.
Well, that might, you could do that. In my view, that may be casting too wide of a net on our many transactions of real estate, because some of them may be producing proceeds that we specifically want to use for affordable housing, say, or for a homeless program or something like that. And the number of real property transactions we have is a much larger set it's a much smaller subset that we're talking about here that deals just with economic development. So, I mean, it could be. I mean, you could do that, but that may produce more than we are intending to produce and have a greater impact on the general fund. So, Mr. Bloomfield.
Which is sort of perfect lead-in because I'm trying to assess what, if any, impact on the general fund this has. And I guess the sales are not necessarily baked into the budget predictions each year, but there's got to be some sense of what this could do to the general fund. Is there an estimate or an average? It's one time, but it's one time of things that happen every year, and on average, there's probably a certain amount of land that we surplus in this fashion.
Yeah, I'm not aware of a budget projection for this fiscal year. GSD, General Services Real Estate Division, which handles all of the surplus property sales, they probably have a better idea, but I don't recall that there is a line item in this year's budget for that, and they typically don't have a projection.
I guess that's what I
So it's hard, yeah, it's very hard to quantify right now.
Well, whatever it was historically will be significantly different going forward because we now have a property inventory that's specifically, targeting and put out there to the marketplace for economic development purposes, which we hadn't done before a year ago. So this is a new thing.
We would know what the extreme is. I mean, what Mr. Kress was talking about if you put all surplus property into this fund, that's one thing, and then this subset would be another thing. I mean, I like the idea of creating the fund. It creates, more flexibility. That's certainly a good thing. In fact, why can't we do this now? I mean, why do we need special authorization? Don't we create funds all the time without legislation?
I think you probably do create special funds, but this locks it more in place. I'm not,
It's the difference between putting a line item in the budget and creating a lockbox trust fund, which requires an implementing ordinance that says this is what you can spend it on. This is money comes in, you can only spend it on. It's a discipline mechanism more than anything else. That's my view. I mean, somebody else correct me if you have a different view.
Discipline on the
I think the
expenditure
authority
side?
was not there for us as a city to dispose of property for economic development purposes.
Say that again.
The authority, prior to the dissolution of the CRA and also prior to the establishment of the Economic Workforce Development Department as a department to handle these types of activities, the authority was not there, and that is one of the tools that was to be provided to EWDD is the establishment of this fund and the authority to conduct transactions for economic development purposes.
Sometimes,
So that's the other piece of this. It's not just about creating the fund, it's creating the authority to dispose of land for the purposes of economic development.
Yes, sir.
Whereas
That's
current-
not in this ordinance. This ordinance only
She's
creates the
saying it is
trust
in
fund.
this ordinance.
It's not.
no, it's just
That
the
was
establishment of the trust fund.
1.2, which we did several years ago.
Right,
Yeah.
so that's, we already have that authority.
That's a new authority. It's something that we've only recently begun, but that's not within the four corners of this
All
ordinance.
this is doing is creating the fund.
Yeah, this is a bank account.
Right.
So I got a question real quick on
Go
that.
ahead.
Give me a second, if you could.
But
Oftentimes, these ideas come from a need because there's something else that we're not aware of. There may be an opportunity, another piece of property, somebody that's come up with a creative way of actually accomplishing a negotiation or something in the background, and there's not a mechanism in place to effectuate that. And then oftentimes, all we hear is the mechanism, not what's going on with some deal that's happening, which may be in the city's best interest. I'm not trying to paint a picture that that there's some other issue, but sometimes it's just about pulling back the layers and following the deal and the money. So, I guess the question is there a proposal somewhere that has brought this to the surface to say if this mechanism were to exist and this fund were in place, it would be easier to navigate to accomplish this objective or this goal or this negotiation on a particular property?
And actually.
We're here for a reason,
Right.
and this
you know,
isn't it.
Having this trust fund will actually allow us to be more efficient.
I understand that.
Yes, and we.
On what particular deal?
Okay, so it's not, well, it's in general. So for example, if we have transactions where we need to deposit funds from a developer, we'll have the capability of doing that through this.
When has this occurred recently where we couldn't do that?
Okay, so currently, is it self-help?
There is a transaction 14-0425S11, which is
Aha.
a transaction for option properties that we have with the Community Redevelopment Agency to designate a local authority. There is one property, 1300 East First Street, where we have signed a purchase and sale agreement with the developer, and that particular transaction has some monies or funds.
Okay,
that-
and there's some issues where this would fix that and
Yes,
allow it to
fix
happen.
that. And that's-
Now we're getting somewhere.
And that's just one of the many, many properties.
I understand,
involved
but
with
that
the
one's
property.
pending. That's why you're here today, right?
One of the reasons.
I get it.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I think perhaps it's a matter of learning, and maybe this isn't the time or place, or it's not agendized for that purpose, but I'd like to peel back the layer even a little further to hear what that deal is and that structure. I know the chair had started off with the idea of putting this off for a week to looking at it further. I would like to be briefed if possible, or maybe even if the chair wants to handle that, I'm fine with that too, or both. But as the vice chair, I would be interested in what the structure is on that deal. And maybe that just learning that would help us look at other opportunities and economic development opportunities in our own districts or citywide. So I'm more fascinated with what brought us here today than where it brings us tomorrow. Okay.
So I will say those are two slightly different questions. I think briefing on this particular example is probably a helpful idea just to
understand the mechanism.
bring more color to it. But the reason that we're here with this ordinance is because the Ad hoc Committee on Jobs Creation wanted to find a mechanism to fund economic development. We've been trying for 5 years to fund the Economic Development Fund that we, created with great fanfare, and have never been able to fund and never been able to do anything with it. Well, now we have a program where we're inventorying the city's assets, presenting that to the world and saying, how can you create jobs and economic activity utilizing these assets? We're finally at a place where we're going to be able to do some of that. And so to make it kind of a win-win, we figure bring the revenues in and then also use those for future economic development as well, since we no longer have redevelopment and we no longer have any of these other sources of opportunities to do it. So it's a way to provide a somewhat steady funding source for future economic development goals.
And I think hearing about the deal, though, too, and this is important to understand that if we move forward with creating this new mechanism, we didn't find out tomorrow that, oh, by the way, since we created this fund and we're trying to figure out an expenditure plan and a path, and as well as the logistical, legislative tracks we have to take to actually get that money spent, and this is the way to get there, that all of a sudden we didn't wake up tomorrow and also drain that fund? That was so difficult. I mean, it'd be nice to know what the deal points were before we create an open door. So I think it behooves us, since it's the confluence of both the deal that drove it and the legislation and the initiatives and the ideas behind it and the spirit, which is great, but that we should hear it all together, or at least know, or at least, if not, the background might be nice to know what we're getting into. So that's what I would ask. And it would be probably better for me then to understand moving forward how this can be beneficial, and then I'd understand it.
Good afternoon, Yolanda Chavez with the CAO's office. And we definitely support this ordinance in terms of establishing some kind of revenue fund for an economic development trust fund. We are, however, concerned about how broad the ordinance is written, because going back to the CRA properties, we've already included in the budget as revenue that 26% that we're expecting to get from CRA through the sale of the site that was just mentioned at First Street, Self-Help Graphics. So so I think it's important that we are able to define how we're going to select this economic development properties. And if it's not through the asset evaluation framework, which you've approved, and say properties that are designated as economic development properties through this process, because it's part of evaluating, finding the deals, EWD working with the developer to make them happen, or is it, how broad are we going to go? Because we are concerned about the impact to the general fund.
Yeah,
and
me
again,
too.
in terms of the CRA properties, those we've already assumed that the 26% is going to the general fund. And we do that annually in terms of the sale of those properties.
And to be clear, my goal was to have it involve the properties that were part of the asset evaluation process already.
Exactly.
You know, what that means, how those are defined within that process, we can discuss further. But it was not to cast a net across every property
Right.
that we dispose of in
Right.
in
I'm
the city.
But also, isn't there a difference here with the properties you're talking about are not owned by the city. Those are state properties, CRA properties, of which
Exactly.
the 26% represents our portion of the split on CRA, you know,
Right.
Right.
or
And we-
any property tax.
Exactly. And so we didn't assume that those CRA properties would be covered under this ordinance, but because it was mentioned, I just wanted to clarify
I'm
that.
assuming that
Okay,
they're specifically not covered because they have
Exactly.
nothing.
Because
to
they're
do
not city-owned.
Right. So just to clarify, the reason why we use this project as an example is because we need this trust fund to deposit the money, not necessarily because the sale would result in a 50% split between the property fund and the economic development fund. It's what we would need this trust fund for this specific project, self-help, is just to use it as a fund control, cash control account for disbursement purposes. So not necessarily for deposits in this case, it's for
But this is a
disbursement.
city-owned property.
No, the property for self-help is CRA. It's a CRA option property.
Yeah, I think we've gone a little too far down the
issues
rat
here,
hole on
right.
this particular project, because this actually has nothing to do with this ordinance.
Right.
It's not a city-owned property, it's not the motivation for this
Right.
policy. It's an example that was thrown up, but it has really nothing to do with what we're talking about here. So, you know, we don't need to belabor that particular deal, because it isn't even covered by this, because it's not city-owned, right?
Right.
It is covered,
Well,
but I
If
understand.
it's a CRA property,
Yeah,
it
it
clearly
could
is
be
not,
used.
because it's not city-owned.
It's really two separate issues, right? Because they
Right.
need an account to use as an account where they could deposit monies, but they also need the account to capture revenue from city-owned properties that are sold as economic development properties into
Right.
the account. So I think that's where we're getting mixed up, but the ordinance really focuses on the city-owned properties that would be designated as economic development properties.
Put another way, the ordinance is intended to define how money goes into the trust fund. This may be an example of how we spend the money in the trust fund, and it could well be. That doesn't need to be so limited, but the money that goes into the trust fund are the proceeds derived from the sale of city-owned property that's been listed under the
Don't
asset.
get too deep on the rabbit hole, but they're talking about the 26%, which is money coming in.
Yeah, and that's not
that would
not
be-
relevant to our discussion. So I think we got sidetracked on that when it
But
was.
was everybody, because I was hearing, you were saying that it was relevant.
It will be money coming in to this trust fund as well as there are third-party deposits coming from the developer that would be deposited into this trust fund if it's approved.
I think it's just a little bit of money.
Yes, a little bit of money. It's not the same as defined on letter B here, which is the city.
A little or a lot is not the issue. It's either yes or no. And this ordinance, as it's drafted, is limited to city-owned properties.
Correct.
So this should not involve CRA properties in any way.
I think they want to use the property, if they get a deposit, as a temporary place to put that deposit in the meantime. I think that's what they're worried about on a piece of property.
Maybe, but that's a different ordinance than what we have before us. That's. Okay, well, you know what? We're holding this, and we'll have further discussion
Thank you.
once we can further define the
Thank you.
objectives. So,
Thank you.
yeah. Okay. Item number 7, please.
Item number 7 is the CAO report relative to an update on the previously proposed debt financing of various judgment obligation bonds.
Good afternoon, Derek Pierce with the Office of the CAO. The report before you has been prepared for informational purposes and recommends no further action related to the previously proposed judgment obligation bond issuance. This office was originally instructed to explore a potential JOB issuance based on expenditure and concerns first identified in the 2016-17 second FSR. The JOB was proposed as a possible tool to address higher than anticipated liability payments and to help maintain the city's reserve fund above the 5% policy minimum. In April 2017, the City Council adopted an authorizing resolution allowing the city to proceed with the judicial validation process and instructed this office to report back to the Budget and Finance Committee after the conclusion of this process and prior to proceeding with the issuance of any bonds. The validation process was completed in October 2017 with a successful default judgment rendered in the city's favor. However, by exercising fiscal restraint, limiting the use of the reserve fund, and identifying additional revenue, the city has been able to address the previously contemplated deficits and maintain a reserve fund balance above 5% without the need to incur debt. So based on these factors, this office would not recommend proceeding with the issuance of the JOBs, and unless otherwise instructed, will not pursue any additional steps associated with the issuance of the previously proposed JOB. So with that, we have to answer any questions you guys may have at this time.
So, in short, all of those matters that were authorized for the use of judgment obligation bond for resolution have been resolved without incurring the need to issue judgment obligation bonds, correct?
That is correct.
And so we can now let the threat of judgment obligation bond fall by the wayside and get behind us, and we will not be issuing judgment obligation bonds.
That is
right?
That is also correct.
Bravo. Okay. So, any questions on this? Anyone want to dance on the grave of the judgment obligation bond? So,
I think I've done enough damage.
I think you have, yeah. So, all right. So, just for the record, in case there's any ambiguity about it, no judgment obligation bonds. Thank you very much.
The proverbial nail in the coffin.
This is. Thank you.
No jobs.
All right. That brings us to item number 8.
Pardon me, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I'm sorry, the action on this item?
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess we're just noting and filing,
Okay.
right? We're noting and filing? We're noting and filing and celebrating.
Okay.
All right.
Item number 8 is the
item number
motion Buscaino-Bonin relative to an instruction to the CEO with the assistance of the Office of Finance to report on the feasibility and fiscal impact of amending the Los Angeles Municipal Code to redefine the term stevedore to include mechanics that perform maintenance and repair of terminal operation equipment, including ship-to-shore cranes, chassis, refrigerated containers, and other equipment to stevedores.
Okay, thank you. And we have one card on this matter. Mr. McCosker, if you'd like to come forward and speak to this matter, and then I think we'll have, are we having a brief report on this too? Is anybody here to present? Okay, good. Mr. McCosker.
Thank you. Chairman and members, Tim McCosker, Glazer Weil, representing Ocean Terminal Services, OTS. I'll be very, very brief. We are in support of the recommendation that it go to the CIO with the assistance of finance to come back with a feasibility report and a study. As additional background, OTS, as an example, is a supplier of services at a terminal, and they supply services that are in the nature of mechanic work and plugging in ships, essentially. As you know, far better than I, that unless someone fits into a category for the business, local business tax, you fall into the gross receipts tax. One of your categories is the stevedore practice, the stevedore business, stevedoring business. It was adopted in 1981. In 1981, stevedoring was a far different endeavor than it is today, given a few things, one of which was innovated here in Los Angeles, and that's the regulation for plugging in a ship so that it uses shore power. Since LA innovated that, now CARB requires it. So that's just an example. Those folks provide the same services, and so we're asking for the study.
Very good. So this is just asking for the CAO to come back with the assistance of the Office of Finance to report on feasibility and impact of amending the code to have a redefinition of what includes stevedores.
Yes, sir.
Consistent with the modern practice of stevedoring, I guess.
Thank you so much.
All right. So do we need to hear anything further on this, members? Any questions? Okay. All right, then if there's no objection, it'll be the action of the committee to approve that item, and look forward to hearing that report back. Mr. Kretz, we took up items 4, 6, 9, 10, 11, and 12 on consent before you got here. If you have any questions or need us to reopen those.
I don't.
Okay.
If
Why
you'd
don't-
like to allow me to vote on them, I'd be happy.
Let's do that. Let's go ahead and reopen all those items without objection for purposes of marking Mr. Kretz's vote in support as well. Okay, that will be the action of the committee, and that concludes.
General public.
Oh, yeah, I know. That concludes the items on today's agenda, so we'll now take general public comment. Mr. Previn, Mr. Watkins, and Mr. Spindler. Mr. Previn.
Thank you. It's Eric Previn from CD2. I live in Studio City. Regarding the litigations that are going on up here, I know it's a struggle. You've got a big stack of litigations. That's what the JOBs were about. We've dodged that bullet. Some of the departments underpaid for the services that we've expected, so we were able to cover the shortfall short term. But there's going to be that excessive cost coming forward, and I don't know what we're doing. We're hiring a conflict panel that has the same firm, Burke, Williams, Sorensen, that's on our CEQA panel. I mean, we're getting a little stacked heavily with a few discrete law firms, and I'm anxious that we don't have a bigger strategy to close the door on some of these lawsuits. I don't know if you know, but I've been studying the retaliation lawsuits, and just in the last 10 years, we've had $40 million worth of retaliation lawsuits at LAPD alone. I mean, we're talking about an enormous amount. We have to close the door, and I'd like to say goodbye to Chief Beck. He did an admirable job for many years, but he's gone. Who's going to lead us forward, sir, with our legal strategy? Thank you
very much. And Mr. Watkins and Mr. Spindler.
Thanks. Good afternoon. Nice to be back. I went to Montana, and I thought I was escaping, and I came back, and I wanted to help LA while I'm here. Our storm drains, I'm in Weistar's district, 14. Storm drains are clogged in the city a lot. The gutters are filled with a lot of trash. I am a volunteer pedestrian street cleaner. No one's paying me right now. But as we look towards, someone said April, a new budget's being drawn. I hope pedestrian street cleaning is considered. I know it's outsourced a little. Mitchell, come on. I like Mitchell today because he doesn't have a tie. And what I think LA needs is a fluorescent bib on you guys and some work. But if you guys don't want to put on the bib, I will. And just please pay me and pay formerly homeless guys like me. I'm almost 16 years sober, Phi Beta Kappa, UCSB, alcoholic. I'm ready to clean. So I hope you guys find some budget to clean our city. Storm drains, gutters, sidewalks. Thanks so much. I'll be emailing you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So go ahead. You have to suck it up. Okay, so when you do a good job, the goat is the first to say so. So you got rid of that. Oh, bye-bye there, Mr. Dibbledorf, yes. As you see, for the record, Mr. Englander chickened out and did not want to listen, which is too bad, because you did a good job in getting rid of judgment obligation bonds. And ironically, the evil of Mitchell Englander prevailed to save the taxpayers millions of dollars, yes. So we will continue to fund the lawsuits. Thank you again to all the lawyers who sue the city. And thank you, Mr. Spindler, for suing the city 3 times. Well, you're welcome. No, thank you. No, thank you. Yes, so again, finally, fuck obligation bonds. Thank you.
All right. Is there anything else before the committee?
No, sir, that clears the
We
desk.
are adjourned.